Welcome, everybody. So I'm Dietrich Stout, the Assistant Director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. And this is another episode of Inside the Lab, as we call it, although today we're talking about ethnography, so I guess it's outside the lab this time. And we're speaking with Dr. Chikako Ozawa-de Silva, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Emory and also serves on the advisory committee for the CMBC. So welcome, Chikako. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Her research focuses on cross-cultural understandings of well-being by bringing together Western and Asian perspectives on the mind, body, religion, medicine, and therapy. Her publications include 2 monographs or books, most recently, The Anatomy of Loneliness, Suicide, Social Connection, and the Search for Relational Meaning in Contemporary Japan, which is, as I mentioned, just out, 2021, and Psychotherapy and Religion in Japan, the Japanese introspection practice of Nikon, not sure that I pronounced that correctly, as well as a co-edited special issue towards an anthropology of loneliness in the journal Transcultural Psychiatry. And she has, as well as that, over 20 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on psychotherapeutic practice, suicide, mind-body relationship, and Tibetan medicine. So thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome, Chikako.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm super excited to have a chance to talk with you.
So if we could just start off, with this new project, or the one you just completed, rather, I should say, loneliness. It's a very topical, timely topic right now, right, with the pandemic and a lot of people experiencing loneliness. But obviously, it's a much longer project for you that you started well before that. So how and why did you actually become interested in this topic of loneliness?
Yeah, good question. I mean, great question, because you're right. The book is coming out in 2021, and a special issue on loneliness came out, last year, 2020. So people told me it's timely, and as you said correctly, but it has been a long-term project. So I actually didn't start off as a project on loneliness, but as a research project on suicide in Japan that gradually led to, uncovering loneliness as a critical underlying issue. So in 1998, suicide rate jumped suddenly and sharply in Japan. So it's like almost by 50% in some age categories, and they remained elevated in the following years. So the Japanese government started looking at what is going on. So they looked at issues such as long-term economic recession that kind of led to the increasing number of unemployment, therefore depression and suicide. But when I started studying suicide, I realized that one of the major underlying causes are loneliness. And as I started exploring loneliness, I realized that the rise of loneliness is a global issue. So that's kind of how I reached to the theme of loneliness.
Interesting. So flowing out of your work on suicide, and you felt that maybe there was something a little bit missing in the way that people were approaching that, this concept of loneliness.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think when you have a more public health oriented studies, seeing from the macro perspectives, the social conditions such as unemployment, clearly, of course, linked, but as a ethnographer, I was following a number of so-called suicide websites. And when I was paying close attention to kind of subjective experiences of people, that's when I realized so-called suicidal people are often talking about this, kind of loneliness. So somebody even left a note, there's a famous note saying, "I'm too lonely to die alone." So that was probably a cue and the beginning of this whole, kind of entire research that I thought of suicide turned out to be a little bit broader and bigger, and how loneliness is a pervasive condition that is afflicting not just suicidal individuals, but others as well.
It's interesting. So you mentioned you're monitoring websites, and so the CMBC here, we're an interdisciplinary center, and so probably a lot of our constituents, a lot of our viewers, and myself also aren't really well versed in the kind of methods that ethnographers use, the kind of ethnographic methods you use. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit then about exactly how you go about conceiving and planning and then executing this kind of a project.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, because I think again that is a question that is often raised, and it is cultural anthropology. What is called more of the qualitative research is often quite different from scientific methods. So in my view, ethnography is primarily a form of exploratory research. It is very different from experimental research in that the parameters are less clearly defined, but as a result, you can see things from a wide perspective, and it is also very well suited for capturing subjective accounts. And it's like as opposed to everything is set kind of model. Ethnography is more like a few things are set. So I think experience research tend to lead to new findings and new things. So I feel like if I started out more narrowly, I might not have come to the realization that what I was studying was not just suicide, but much more pervasive condition of loneliness. So I hope, that explains, answers to your question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So that's interesting because, when you're talking about sort of exploratory work, is there also a process of narrowing that goes on, or is it important to avoid kind of converging on what you think is the answer or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, because as a cultural anthropologist, I feel like we often cast a wide range. We try to see from the macro perspective initially to look at different aspects, and starting broad and definitely going narrow and narrower as we start finding actually the key issues, themes, and certain questions that seem to be important. So in my case, I thought, yes, actually study of suicide I thought that was going to be what this new book was going to be about. But then studying suicide led me to realize, loneliness is a deep underlying causes. And then once I realized that, then I realized this loneliness is not just an issue among so-called suicidal people, but among college students, among different groups of people. And I think, actually, even in the US, you really do see, nowadays loneliness is recognized as a public health issue and global pandemic. So yeah, that's how kind of I landed on loneliness eventually.
Thank you. And so there's a couple interesting things that you just mentioned in your answer there. One of which is you brought up the comparison between Japan and the United States, and I wanted to follow up on this cross-cultural perspective. And the other is that people are recognizing that loneliness is a public health issue, and yet I don't know whether or not it's well defined as some existing categories like depression and so forth. So maybe we could talk about that as well. But, so maybe starting with the cross-cultural perspective, how is that important to your work? How does that play out in what you do?
Yeah, well, to that question, I would say actually we are all a fish in water. What I mean is that we all have blind spots and biases, but we don't think we do, right? And so you will never know your own culture and yourself until you're exposed to something different from your own culture. So I think that's like kind of basic 101 in cultural anthropology. So for example, even like traveling, I think is a good way of having a taste of what it means to have this cross-cultural perspectives. If you are traveling and then staying in a foreign country for more than a month, like if it's a couple of months, then you start seeing, right, like what you thought of the common sense might not be the same in where you are kind of living. And it's kind of, sometimes it's hardest to know about your own culture and cultural norms and about yourself until you're exposed to the other. So that's probably that would be probably the most concise answer to that question about the why cross-cultural perspectives so important. So, and to your second set of question is, loneliness, and then, how does it add to more conventional psychiatric categories like depression, right? So I would say loneliness is not depression. It is an universal human experience, and it would be misleading or distortion to reduce it to a psychiatric category of mental illness. I think loneliness sheds light on our need to be, our need to connect socially and a fundamental need for social support. It's an important different perspective on issues like suicide and other social issues. When we think about loneliness, we probably think of a single solitary individual, but in contemporary times, loneliness is actually a social issue. And I think contemporary scholarship is therefore focusing on loneliness as not merely an individual matter, but a public health issue that negatively impacts both physical and psychological health, and even increasing the risk of mortality. So I think that's what the loneliness study would add to the current scholarship.
Right. And so part of what you've attempted to do in this project then is to maybe wrestle a little bit more with what this thing loneliness is and its varieties. And I don't know if a definition would be pushing it too far or too restrictive, but at least a characterization. I note that you mentioned that loneliness is universal, a human universal. And of course, as you know, anytime you propose something as a human universal, that's a bit, that can be controversial. So, I mean, is it really, in what sense would you see loneliness to be universal versus how does it vary across different cultural contexts and individuals?
Yeah, I would say first, yes to both. So I would say that yes, loneliness is universal. And I know as a cultural anthropologist, cultural differences are crucial. So it's not like neither A nor B. So it is universal because, and I actually use the expression that loneliness is everyone's business because we human beings are social animals whose survival depends on belonging. And yet also, we are individuals who need to differentiate ourselves from others. So this tension creates loneliness. So in that way, loneliness is a universal, not just human experience, but, among mammals. So that's that. But loneliness, also involves expectations about what kind of social relationships people feel they want or need. So these expectations come from culture and society. And if they go, they go unmet, this causes loneliness. In societies that highly value productivity, individuals feel that their worth their worth are only what they produce, right? But if they don't feel intrinsically valued, they don't feel genuinely cared for. So this puts people at risk who are not highly productive, such as the elderly, the young, or other categories. So when people cannot fulfill such social expectations, they feel worthless, disconnected, unneeded, and lonely. So when groups of people are marginalized, this also creates a collective experience of loneliness. So these are all cultural, processes, and that, they manifest differently across societies. So in that way, so I would say yes to both. It is universal, but it manifests differently. It is experienced differently because of the expectations about the kind of relationships, people think they need to have.
Thank you. Yeah. So if I could maybe ask just one follow-up question on that, because as you're talking, I guess the intuition or the conventional usage of loneliness in the United States would often, I think, people think about close personal relationships, informal friends, family, being like, if you don't have that, you'll be lonely. Maybe even if you're successful at work, you'll still be lonely, and these kinds of things. But we're just saying that loneliness can also be about feeling valued. And so I just wonder, to what extent can people experience or not experience loneliness, not necessarily whether they're around other people. Maybe I don't even have any physical or even social interactions with people, and yet I feel valued in my work, and people read my articles or something, and now I don't feel so. How variable can it? What makes people lonely or not? Can it change? Does it need to be this sort of personal interaction?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you're right. It oftentimes loneliness is closely connected to these relationships. But then, as Cacioppo correctly put it, loneliness is about ultimately subjective, appraisal of the situation. So, I also often say that being alone and feeling alone, and being alone and being lonely are conceptually different. So, that means loneliness and social isolations are not the same thing. So you could be surrounded by so many people. You could be the most popular person in your class, like let's say a teenager who is the most popular person in the class, and then no one can tell that a person could be experiencing loneliness, and they could be, of course. So in that way, I think that just the mere physical human connections do not result in happiness or not feeling lonely. It is, loneliness is perceived and then felt social isolation. And again, that's why expectation plays a major role. And then our expectations, even though, people might think, well, that this is my personal expectations that I have on me, but our expectations are often influenced and then kind of cultivated by the collective large society and culture we live. So that's why I was using example of US. US definitely values the high productivity, but the cost of such cultural expectation is when we are not productive. And that is an inevitable thing to happen to all of us. We all get sick, we all get old, and eventually retire. So then, it's a very unforgiving social expectation to have, because we are all destined to feel lonely at some point. So I often say, loneliness is it's a feelings of dissatisfaction that arise with regard to relationships to others or to the environment. So yeah, on top of this, absence of human relationship, or what people think of the meaningful human relationships, actually place environment actually also plays major factors. We actually also have relationships and a connection with certain place, and being disconnected from a place also leads to loneliness. So I think that's why people who are forced to, right, like leave their own place, dislocated people, experience intense loneliness, or the entire community might be experiencing loneliness.
That's interesting to think of, that you could also be lonely with respect to a place or a situation. In a way, it just broadens this concept, I guess, to being more of your sort of position within some kind of network, not even purely a social one, but sort of a matrix that you exist in. And if you feel out of place with it or disconnected.
Yeah. I think that's why COVID really was challenging to so many people, you know. Yeah, when I teach undergraduate classes, sometimes I do bring up on that aspect, and then how we all have a place or two that we like, but meaning somehow that we feel strong connection with. So in my case, I'm from Japan, and well, one particular region in Japan. So when I don't visit the place for a long time, like this, last year and a half, that definitely brings a certain sense of, like deprivation and loneliness. And I probably started watching more, Japanese movies, so that at least I can experience virtually, like, the sense of being there. So yeah, I mean, for that reason, I'll probably talk more when I give my talk in a few weeks. But in terms of one of the remedies for loneliness, if people are having difficulty or inability to form meaningful relationships, so for whatever the reason, maybe think about the place that they feel they can connect with. So visit there, or at least see pictures, images of the place. That might reduce this intense experience of loneliness. So yeah, we are like talking about affordances, we are truly a social and environmental meeting and beings. So
yeah, well, the idea of visiting a few special places right now does sound quite attractive after a year and a half, I must say. So well, thank you very much. That's been a great discussion. I did want to ask if there's anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to comment on, or you thought, the question I should have asked, or anything like that.
No, I think, DC really raised a number of very important issues and questions. And the good thing is, like, I think, not many people will dispute or disagree with this, loneliness being a serious issue. So, the UK has the Minister of Loneliness. So I think it's good that at least collectively people are realizing, well, loneliness is not just like an individual problem. It's much bigger. So maybe society may have to think about what to do. There are, certain societies which are heading to more so-called lonely societies than others. And again, I hope to maybe explore a little bit more during my talk. Yeah.
Well, and hopefully the book and the work you've done, maybe it'll help us find some answers as more people are trying to deal with these issues. Thank you. I did want to also reiterate, you mentioned a couple times, but you'll be giving a talk for us on, is it the 16th of September, I believe?
16, maybe Thursday. I just remember it's Thursday. Yeah, is it 16? Yeah.
So Thursday, 4 p.m., 16th. It'll be online. So the CMBC website will have links for people to come see you talk a little bit more and develop this concept of loneliness. But thank you so much for joining me today and for having this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity. So I really enjoyed actually talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll see you at the talk.